Welcome back to this quiet space between waking and sleep, this threshold where the day releases you and the night receives you with open hands. You've found your way here, and that simple act of arrival is enough. You don't need to bring anything with you. Not your worries, not your plans, not the weight of what happened or what might happen. You can leave all of that at the door, the way travelers once left their shoes before entering a temple. Tonight we return to the old paths, the worn trails where monks once walked, where teachers sat beneath trees, where silence was not empty but full of the sound of wind through pine needles, full of breath, full of the simple fact of being alive in a world that asks only that we notice. Find your place of rest now. Let your body settle into whatever holds it. Feel your shoulders drop just a little more. Feel your jaw soften, your hands uncurl. There's nowhere to go from here. Nothing to do. The world will turn without your help tonight, and that's a gift. We'll walk together through these stories, slowly, the way pilgrims walk to sacred places, not rushing, not straining, simply moving through the landscape of these old tales. And if you drift away before the stories end, that's perfectly fine. That's the whole point. These stories will keep going, like rivers flowing past sleeping villages, whether you hear them or not. So breathe, softly, deeply. Let the stories begin. The first story takes us to a monastery that stood at the edge of the world, or what felt like the edge, where land met sky without clear boundary and clouds drifted through the courtyards like visitors. There was a monk in that monastery whose practice was so simple that the other monks found it almost embarrassing. While they studied texts, debated philosophy, and pursued complex meditation techniques, this monk, whose name was Takashi, simply counted breaths. He had been counting breaths for 30 years, not as a beginning exercise, not as a foundation for something more advanced, but as the practice itself, complete and sufficient. He would sit in the meditation hall, or in his small room, or sometimes on a stone bench in the garden, and he would count, one breath in, one breath out. That was one. Another breath in, another breath out. That was two. He would count to 10, and then begin again at 1. That was all he did. The other monks found this perplexing. Surely after 30 years, Takashi should have moved on to higher practices, deeper realizations, more sophisticated understandings. But Takashi showed no interest in advancement. He counted breaths. One spring morning, a young monk named Kenji, brilliant and ambitious, approached Takashi in the garden. Takashi was sitting on his usual bench, eyes half closed, breathing steadily. Kenji bowed. "Brother Takashi, may I ask you a question?" Takashi opened his eyes slowly, as if returning from a great distance. "Of course. I have been watching you," Kenji said, choosing his words carefully. "For months now, and I see that you do nothing but count breaths. Forgive my directness, but why? What are you seeking? What are you trying to achieve?" Takashi looked at the young monk with gentle eyes. "I am not seeking anything, but surely there must be a purpose, a goal, some realization you're working toward." Takashi shook his head slowly. "I breathe, I count, that is all." Kenji felt frustration rising in his chest. "But that's just a beginner's exercise. I learned that in my first week here. Surely you've gone beyond that by now." "Gone beyond?" Takashi smiled slightly. "Where would I go? To deeper practice, to enlightenment, to—" "Sit with me," Takashi interrupted gently. "Breathe with me, count with me." Kenji hesitated. He had important studies to return to, texts to read, a debate to prepare for. But something in Takashi's quiet invitation held him. He sat down on the bench beside the older monk. "Close your eyes," Takashi said. "Breathe naturally. When the breath comes in, notice it. When it goes out, notice it. One breath in and out is one. Count to 10, then begin again. That's all." Kenji closed his eyes and began. Breath in, breath out. 1. Breath in, breath out. 2. It seemed absurdly simple. His mind immediately began to wander to the debate he was preparing, to a conversation from yesterday, to what he would eat for lunch. He realized he had lost count. He started over. 1, 2, 3. His leg itched. He noticed it, tried to ignore it, felt it grow more insistent. He lost count again, started over. 1. How long had it been? A few minutes. He peeked one eye open. Takashi sat motionless beside him, face peaceful, breath flowing as naturally as water flowing downhill. Kenji closed his eye and tried again. 1, 2. His mind jumped to a question about a sutra he had been studying. He grabbed at the thought, tried to hold it, tried to work through it, then remembered he was supposed to be counting. He had no idea what number he was on. Started over. 1. This continued for what felt like hours, but was perhaps 20 minutes. Finally, Kenji opened his eyes fully and turned to Takashi. "I can't do it," he said, frustrated. "My mind won't stay still. I keep losing count." Takashi opened his eyes and looked at him with infinite patience. "Yes, that's it? Just yes?" "You have discovered something important," Takashi said. "You have discovered that you cannot control your mind, but I need to control it. That's the whole point of practice." "Is it?" Takashi turned his gaze to the garden, where cherry blossoms were beginning to fall, drifting through the air like snow. "Do you control when those blossoms fall?" "No." "Do you control when your heart beats?" "No." "Do you control when thoughts arise in your mind?" Kenji paused. "No," he admitted quietly, "but I should be able to." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Kenji opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. Why should he be able to control his thoughts? Because that was what monks did. Because that was the point of meditation. Because without control, how could there be enlightenment? "I don't know," he finally said. Takashi nodded. "This is good. Not knowing is the beginning." They sat together in silence for a while. Cherry blossoms continued to fall. A bird called from somewhere in the trees. The wind moved through the garden, rustling leaves, carrying the scent of earth and flowers. "I have been counting breaths for 30 years, Takashi said eventually, "and I still lose count. I still find my mind wandering. I still forget what number I'm on, still have to start over. Do you know what I have learned from this?" "What?" "That the counting doesn't matter. The number doesn't matter. What matters is noticing when the mind wanders and gently bringing it back, over and over, thousands of times, tens of thousands of times. This gentle bringing back, this is the practice. This is everything." But that sounds endless, like a task that can never be completed. "Yes," Takashi said, and his smile was so genuine, so full of something that Kenji could only call joy, that it stopped the young monk's breath. "That's exactly what it is." Kenji sat with this. "So you're saying there's no goal? No achievement? No point where you can say, 'I've done it, I'm finished'?" "Breath doesn't finish," Takashi said. "As long as you live, breath continues. In, out, in, out. Why should the practice of noticing breath be any different?" "But then, what's the point?" Takashi stood up slowly, his old knees creaking slightly. The point is breathing. The point is noticing. The point is being alive right now, in this moment, with cherry blossoms falling and the wind moving and your heart beating without your permission. What more point do you need? He bowed to Kenji and walked slowly toward the meditation hall, his footsteps soft on the stone path. Kenji sat alone on the bench. He looked at the garden, really looked at it for the first time in weeks. The cherry trees were losing their blossoms, pink petals covering the ground like a soft carpet. The pond reflected the sky perfectly, a mirror showing clouds drifting past. A frog sat on a lily pad, utterly still, waiting for nothing. He closed his eyes and took a breath. In, out, one. His mind immediately wandered to what Takashi had said, trying to analyze it, understand it, to fit it into his framework of knowledge. He noticed the wandering, brought his attention back. In, out, two. Thought arose. This is too simple, he noticed. Brought attention back. In, out, three. Thought arose. I'm doing it wrong, he noticed. Brought attention back. In, out, four. Thought arose. How long should I sit here, he noticed. Brought attention back. In, out, five. And slowly, very slowly, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not like a revelation or an enlightenment, just a small softening, like ice beginning to melt at the edges. The urgency he had been carrying, the constant push toward achievement, toward understanding, toward becoming someone more advanced than he was, it loosened just a little. He sat for an hour, maybe more. He lost count hundreds of times, started over hundreds of times. And each time he started over, he did so without judgment, without frustration, simply returning to one, returning to breath, returning to the only moment that actually existed, which was this one. When he finally opened his eyes, the sun had moved across the sky. The shadows in the garden had lengthened. His legs were stiff from sitting, but something in his chest felt lighter, more open, as if a door he hadn't known was closed had been cracked open just a little. He found Takashi later that evening in the meditation hall. The older monk was sitting in his usual place, eyes half closed, breathing steadily. Kenji sat down beside him without speaking. He closed his eyes. He began to count. 1, 2, 3. This became Kenji's practice. Not instead of his studies, not instead of his other duties, but alongside them, beneath them, running through them like an underground river. Every day, he would sit and count breaths, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Sometimes he would make it to 10 without losing count. More often he would lose track at 3 or 5 or 7 and start again. Weeks passed, months, years. Kenji's understanding of the texts deepened. His philosophical insights grew more refined. But underneath all of that, always, was the counting, the breathing, the simple, endless practice of noticing when his mind wandered and bringing it back. Other monks asked him what he was doing. He told them he was counting breaths. They looked confused, disappointed even. Wasn't he capable of more advanced practice? He would smile, and his smile, over time, began to resemble Takashi's smile, and he would say, I'm learning the most advanced practice there is. I'm learning to be here. 10 years passed, then 15. Takashi grew older, frailer, his steps became slower, his body more bent. But he still sat every day, still counted breaths, still smiled that gentle smile of someone who had found exactly what he needed by giving up the search entirely. One winter morning, Takashi did not appear for morning meditation. Kenji went to his room and found him lying on his mat, his body still, his face peaceful. He had died sometime in the night, quietly, the way a candle goes out when the wax is gone. Kenji knelt beside his teacher's body and placed his hand on the older monk's chest. It was cold, but not frightening, just empty. The breath that had moved in and out for so many decades had stopped, had gone wherever breath goes when it leaves the body. Kenji sat beside Takashi for a long time. He didn't pray, he didn't chant, he simply sat and breathed. In, out, 1, in, out, 2. He counted, and in the counting, he felt Takashi's presence, not as a ghost or a spirit, but as a practice, as a way of being that had been passed from teacher to student, like a flame passed from one candle to another. They carried Takashi's body to the funeral pyre that afternoon. The monks chanted sutras, performed the proper rites, said the proper words. The fire consumed the body, and the smoke rose into the winter sky, dispersing, becoming indistinguishable from the clouds. Kenji stood and watched until the fire burned down to embers, until there was nothing left but ash and bones. And then he walked to the garden, to the stone bench where he had first sat with Takashi all those years ago. He sat down, closed his eyes, took a breath. In, out, 1. His mind wandered immediately to grief, to loss, to the absence of his teacher. He noticed, brought his attention back. In, out, 2, thought arose. What will I do without him? He noticed. Brought attention back. In, out, 3, thought arose. He's really gone, he noticed. Brought attention back. In, out, 4. And as he counted, sitting on that cold stone bench in the winter garden, he understood something that couldn't be put into words but could only be lived. Takashi wasn't gone. The breath continued. The practice continued. The gentle returning, the endless starting over, the patient noticing all of it continued because it had never been Takashi's practice to begin with. It was just practice. It belonged to everyone and no one. It was as impersonal and universal as breathing itself. He sat until dark. He sat until he could no longer feel his legs. He sat until the counting dissolved and there was just breathing, just being, just the simple fact of existence happening without anyone doing it. When he finally stood and walked back to his room, his legs were stiff and painful, but his heart was quiet. He lay down on his mat and pulled his thin blanket over himself. He closed his eyes and felt his breath moving in and out, counting itself, needing nothing, being everything. And somewhere in that darkness, in that surrender to the breath that came without asking and left without permission, he found what he had been seeking all along, which was nothing at all, which was everything, which was just this, breathing in, breathing out, being alive, and that being enough. Years later, when Kenji was old himself, a young monk approached him in the garden. The young monk had watched Kenji sit and count breaths for months and couldn't understand why. Kenji listened to the young monk's questions, heard the urgency in his voice, the hunger for advancement, the fear of wasting time on simple practices. And Kenji smiled, Takashi's smile, passed down, inherited, belonging to everyone who had ever sat and counted breaths and lost count and started over. Sit with me, Kenji said gently. Breathe with me. Count with me. The young monk hesitated, then sat. Close your eyes, Kenji said. Breathe naturally. When the breath comes in, notice it. When it goes out, notice it. One breath in and out is one. Count to 10, then begin again. That's all. And the practice continued, passed from one breath to the next, from one moment to the next, from one monk to the next, endless and simple and utterly complete, like a river that has always been flowing and will always flow, needing nothing, being everything, just breath, just life, just this. And in a village where time seemed to move more slowly than elsewhere, as if the clocks had been told to rest and had gratefully accepted the invitation, there lived a weaver named Ayemi. She was not famous. Her cloth was not sold in distant markets or worn by nobles. She wove for the village simple cloth for simple clothes, rough fabric for work robes, soft cloth for swaddling babies, sturdy cloth for wrapping the dead. Her loom sat in a small room at the back of her house, next to a window that looked out onto a garden where morning glories climbed a bamboo trellis. Ayame had been weaving for 40 years. She had learned from her mother, who had learned from her mother, back through generations until the beginning of the skill was lost in time. The loom she used had been her grandmother's and her great-grandmother's before that. The wood was worn smooth by hands, darkened by years, patient and solid. Every morning, Ayame would wake before dawn, make tea, and sit at her loom. She would run her hands over the threads, feeling their tension, their readiness. Then she would begin. The sound of weaving is a particular sound, rhythmic and repetitive. The shuttle passing through the warp threads, the beater pushing the weft into place, the treadles rising and falling beneath her feet. Thump, slide, press. Thump, slide, press. The rhythm was as steady as a heartbeat, as natural as breathing, and Ayame had been doing it so long that she no longer thought about the movements. Her hands knew what to do, her feet knew what to do. She simply sat and allowed the weaving to happen through her. One day, a young woman from the next village came to apprentice with Ayame. The young woman's name was Naomi, and she had tried several crafts, pottery, calligraphy, woodworking, but none had felt right. She hoped weaving would be different. Ayame accepted her without ceremony. She showed Naomi the loom, explained the basic movements, and set her to work on a simple piece. Just cloth, Ayame said. Nothing fancy, just practice. Naomi worked eagerly, her hands quick, her mind focused. But the cloth that emerged from her loom was uneven. The threads too tight in some places, too loose in others. After a few hours, Naomi stopped and looked at her work with frustration. "It's terrible," she said. Ayame came over and examined the cloth. "It's learning," she said, "but look at yours." Naomi pointed to the cloth on Ayame's loom, which was perfect, every thread exactly where it should be, the pattern emerging clean and clear. "Yours is beautiful, mine is a mess." "Mine has 40 years in it," Ayame said. "Yours has 3 hours. They're different things." Naomi worked all day, growing more and more frustrated. The cloth wasn't getting better. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. Her hands were tense, her shoulders tight, her jaw clenched. By evening, she wanted to throw the shuttle across the room. Ayame sat down beside her. "Stop," she said gently. Naomi stopped, breathing hard, almost in tears. "You're trying too hard," Ayame said. "How can I try too hard? I need to get better. I need to make good cloth." "Why?" The question surprised Naomi. Because that's the point, to make something good." Ayame shook her head slowly. "No, that's not the point." "Then what is?" "Watch me," Ayame said. She sat at her own loom and began to weave. Her movements were slow, almost lazy. There was no tension in her body, no striving in her hands. She passed the shuttle through, pulled the beater, moved the treadles, all with such ease that it looked effortless. But it wasn't effortless in the way that experts make things look easy. It was effortless in a different way, as if she weren't trying at all, as if the weaving were simply happening and she was just there, present, allowing it. "Do you see?" Ayame asked, not stopping her work. "I see that you're good at it." "No, look deeper. What am I doing?" Naomi watched more carefully. She watched Ayame's hands, her face, her breathing, and slowly she began to see it. Ayame wasn't focused on the cloth. She wasn't thinking about the finished product, about making something good or bad. She was simply present with each movement. Shuttle through, beater pressed, treadle down, shuttle back. Each action complete in itself, not reaching toward the next action, not judging the previous action, just this movement, now. Then this movement, now. Then this movement, now. "You're not thinking about it," Naomi said quietly. "No, you're just doing it. Not even that. It's just happening. I'm just here." Ayame stopped weaving and turned to face Naomi. "When you weave, where is your mind?" Naomi thought about it. Everywhere. On the finished cloth. On how bad I am. On how good you are. On whether I'll ever learn this. On what I'll make once I get good. On everywhere except here, Ayame finished. "Yes, that's why your cloth is uneven. Because you're not with it. You're ahead of it, behind it, beside it, but never with it." Naomi felt something crack open in her chest, a realization that was both painful and freeing. "So how do I fix it?" "You don't fix it, you just come here. You bring your mind to your hands. You feel the thread, you hear the shuttle, you breathe, and you let everything else go." "That sounds impossible." Ayame smiled. "It is impossible. And you'll do it anyway. A little bit at a time. One thread at a time. One moment at a time." Naomi returned to her loom. She sat for a moment, just breathing, just feeling her body on the bench, her feet on the treadles, her hands holding the shuttle. Then she began to weave. Shuttle through. She felt it pass between the threads, felt the slight resistance, the gentle give, beater pressed. She felt the weft thread settle into place, heard the soft thump, treadle down. She felt her foot press, felt the warp threads shift. Her mind wandered almost immediately to lunch, to a conversation from yesterday, to worry about the cloth, she noticed. Brought herself back, shuttle through. She wove for an hour, maybe more. Her mind wandered hundreds of times. Each time, she noticed and came back. Shuttle through. Beater pressed, treadle down. The cloth that emerged was still uneven, still imperfect, but something had changed in the making of it. There were moments, brief moments, where she wasn't thinking about the cloth at all, where she was simply weaving, where the separation between weaver and weaving disappeared, and there was just this thread, hands, breath, movement. Days passed, weeks. Naomi wove every day, sitting beside Ayame, learning not through instruction but through presence. Slowly, very slowly, her cloth became more even. The threads began to settle into the right tension. The pattern began to emerge more clearly. But more than that, something in Naomi herself began to settle. The urgency faded. The constant judging faded. There was just weaving, moment by moment, thread by thread. One morning, several months into her apprenticeship, Naomi arrived to find Ayame sitting at the loom but not weaving. She was just sitting, her hands resting on the threads, her eyes closed. "Ayame," Naomi said quietly, "are you all right?" Ayame opened her eyes and smiled. "I'm listening." "To what?" "To the loom, to what it wants to become today." Naomi didn't understand, but she sat at her own loom and tried to listen. At first she heard nothing. Then she heard birds outside, the wind in the trees, her own breath. She let her hands rest on the threads and felt their texture, their tension, their readiness. And then, very faintly, she felt something. Not a sound, not a voice, but a kind of knowing. A sense of what the cloth wanted to be, not based on what she wanted to make, but based on the threads themselves, the tension they held, the pattern they suggested. She began to weave, following that subtle knowing rather than any plan in her mind. The shuttle moved through the threads, the beater pressed, the treadles rose and fell. She wove for hours, completely absorbed, completely present, and when she finally stopped and looked at what she had made, she was surprised. The cloth was different from anything she had woven before. The pattern had emerged almost of its own accord, a design she hadn't planned, hadn't thought about, but that felt completely right. It was simple, elegant, and somehow alive in a way her other work hadn't been. Ayame came over and looked at it. She ran her fingers across the cloth, feeling its texture, its weight. Then she looked at Naomi and nodded. "Now you understand," she said. "Understand what?" "That you are not the weaver. You are the space where weaving happens." Naomi sat with those words. They didn't make logical sense, but they made a deeper kind of sense, a felt sense that lived in her hands and her breath rather than her mind. She continued her apprenticeship for another year. Every day, she wove. Every day, she practiced being present, being here, allowing the weaving to happen through her rather than trying to make it happen. Some days were easy. Some days her mind was restless, and she had to bring herself back 1,000 times. But she kept weaving, kept sitting at the loom, kept showing up. Eventually, Ayame told her she was ready to work on her own. Naomi returned to her village and set up a small weaving room. She made cloth for the villagers, simple cloth, useful cloth, and in the making of it, she practiced what Ayame had taught her not as a technique, but as a way of being. Years passed. Naomi became known as a skilled weaver, though she never thought of herself that way. She just wove. She sat at her loom every morning, listened to what the threads wanted to become, and allowed her hands to move, her feet to press the treadles, the shuttle to pass through. Sometimes the cloth was beautiful, sometimes it was just ordinary. She treated both the same, weaving each with full presence, full attention, knowing that the cloth itself didn't matter as much as the weaving, and the weaving didn't matter as much as the presence, and the presence was everything. One day, an old woman came to Naomi's door. The woman was thin and bent, her hair white, her hands gnarled with age. Naomi recognized her immediately. It was Ayame. "Teacher," Naomi said, bowing deeply. Ayame smiled. "I'm not your teacher anymore. We're just two weavers." Naomi invited her in, made tea, and they sat together in the weaving room. Ayame looked at Naomi's loom, at the cloth currently on it, at the finished pieces folded neatly in the corner. "You've done well," Ayame said. "I just weave." "Yes, that's doing well." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking tea, watching the light move through the window. Finally, Naomi asked the question that had been growing in her for years. "Ayame, why did you teach me?" I was nothing. I couldn't even weave a straight line. Why did you waste your time? Ayame set down her tea and looked at Naomi with those clear, gentle eyes. Because you needed to learn, and I needed to teach. Not because I had knowledge to give you, but because teaching you taught me. Every time I watched you struggle, every time I watched you come back to presence, I was reminded. I was taught again. You were my teacher as much as I was yours, but you were already a master. Ayame laughed, a soft, genuine laugh. There's no such thing as a master. There are only people who show up at the loom, day after day, and weave. Some do it for 40 years. Some do it for 4. The length doesn't matter. The showing up matters. The presence matters. Everything else is just thread. She stood slowly, her old body creaking. I should go. I'm staying with my niece in the next village. But I wanted to see you, to see that you're still weaving. Naomi walked her to the door. They bowed to each other, deeply, and Ayame walked away down the path, her steps slow but steady. Naomi watched her go until she disappeared around a bend. Then she returned to her loom, sat down, and placed her hands on the threads. She closed her eyes and listened. The threads hummed quietly, waiting. She opened her eyes and began to weave. Shuttle through, beater pressed, treadle down, shuttle through. Beater pressed, treadle down. The rhythm was steady, ancient, passed down through generations of hands, through years of sitting, through millions of moments of presence. It was just weaving, just thread, just this moment, now, and this moment, now, and this moment, now, forever, without beginning, without end. Just the eternal present where the shuttle passes and the beater presses and life happens, simply, quietly, completely. And the cloth grew, thread by thread, moment by moment, each thread necessary, each moment complete, and together they formed something whole, something useful, something that would clothe a body or swaddle a child or wrap the dead, returning always to the earth from which the thread came, completing the circle, beginning again, endless and simple and utterly sufficient. And somewhere between mountains, in a monastery so old that even the stones had forgotten when they were placed, there hung a bell. The bell was bronze, green with age, and it hung in a wooden frame in the center of the courtyard. It was rung 3 times a day at dawn, at noon, and at dusk to call the monks to meditation. The sound of the bell was deep and pure, and it carried across the valley, reaching farms and forests and the small villages that dotted the mountainside. The monk whose duty it was to ring the bell was named Jiro. He had been ringing the bell for 15 years, and he rang it the way most people do repeated tasks competently, automatically, without much thought. He would walk to the courtyard at the appointed times, pick up the wooden mallet, strike the bell 3 times, and walk away. The bell would ring, the monks would gather, and life would continue. Jiro did not think there was anything special about ringing the bell. It was just a task, a duty, one of many small duties that kept the monastery functioning. He did not reflect on it. He did not bring particular attention to it. He simply did it. One winter morning, Jiro woke before dawn to ring the bell. It had snowed during the night, and the courtyard was covered in a thick white blanket, unmarked by footprints. The world was utterly silent, that particular silence that comes after snow, when sound itself seems to have been buried. Jiro walked to the bell, his feet crunching softly in the snow. He picked up the mallet and prepared to strike, but something made him pause. The silence was so complete, so profound that the thought of breaking it felt almost violent. He stood there, mallet in hand, and for the first time in 15 years, he actually thought about what he was doing. He was about to strike a bell. The bell would sound. The sound would travel across the valley. Monks would hear it and come to meditate. But before the sound, there was silence. And after the sound faded, there would be silence again. The sound came from silence and returned to silence. It was born from nothing and disappeared into nothing. Jiro stood there, thinking these thoughts, and then he struck the bell. The sound rang out, deep and clear, breaking the silence, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The tone carried across the snow, across the valley, impossibly loud in the quiet morning. Jiro listened as the sound faded, slowly, gradually, until it was gone, and the silence returned, unchanged, as if the sound had never been. He struck the bell 2 more times, as was the custom, and each time he listened more carefully, hearing not just the sound but the silence before and after, the way the sound emerged from nothing and dissolved back into nothing, like a wave rising from the ocean and falling back into it. When he walked away from the bell that morning, something had shifted. He couldn't name it, but he knew that he would never ring the bell the same way again. From that day forward, Jiro's relationship with the bell changed. Every time he approached it, he would pause first and listen to the silence. He would feel the weight of the mallet in his hand. He would notice the air, the temperature, the quality of light. Then, with full attention, with complete presence, he would strike the bell, and he would listen, not just to the sound, but to everything. The initial strike, loud and bright, the way the tone swelled and filled the air, the slow fading, the gradual dissolution, the point where sound became silence, and it was impossible to say when one ended and the other began. The other monks noticed. The bell sounded different now, not in pitch or volume, but in quality, in feeling. When Jiro rang the bell, it seemed to carry something more than just sound. It carried attention, intention, presence. The bell had always called the monks to meditation, but now the ringing itself was a meditation. One day, the abbot called Jiro to his chamber. "Jiro," the abbot said, "I have noticed a change in the bell. Tell me, what are you doing differently?" Jiro bowed. "Nothing, master. I ring it 3 times, as I always have. But it sounds different. Does it?" The abbot studied him. "You're listening, aren't you?" "Yes." "To the bell?" "To the silence." The abbot nodded slowly. "Tell me what you hear." Jiro was quiet for a long time, trying to put into words something that lived beyond words. Finally, he said, "I hear that the sound is not separate from the silence. The bell rings, and the sound appears, but it comes from silence and returns to silence. The silence is always there, before and after enduring. The sound is just a temporary visitor. And what does this teach you? That everything is like this. Thoughts, feelings, people, lives, they all arise from silence and return to silence. They come and go, but the silence remains, and the silence is not empty. It's full. It's everything." The abbot smiled. "You have learned from the bell what many monks spend lifetimes trying to learn from sutras. Continue your practice." Jiro bowed and left. He continued to ring the bell 3 times a day, but now each ringing was a complete practice. He would approach the bell with reverence, not because the bell was holy, but because the moment was holy, because every moment was holy, because presence itself was the only sacred thing. Winter turned to spring. Spring turned to summer. The bell rang through all seasons, through sun and rain, through heat and cold, and Jiro rang it, listening always to the silence, to the space from which sound emerged and into which it dissolved. One evening, as he was ringing the bell for dusk meditation, a young monk approached him. The young monk had been watching Jiro for weeks, confused and curious. "Brother Jiro," the young monk said after the last ring had faded, "may I ask you a question?" "Of course." "Why do you take so long to ring the bell? The rest of us just strike it and go. But you stand there before and after. You listen." "What are you listening for?" Jiro set down the mallet and turned to the young monk. "I'm not listening for anything. I'm just listening." "But why?" "Come," Jiro said. "Stand with me. I'll ring it one more time. Listen with me." The young monk stepped closer. Jiro picked up the mallet, waited until both their breathing had settled, and then struck the bell. The sound rang out, full and deep. They stood together, listening. The sound began to fade, slowly, and they listened to it fade, heard it grow softer, quieter, until it was barely audible, a whisper, and then even the whisper was gone, and there was only silence. "Did you hear it?" Jiro asked. "The bell?" "The moment when the sound became silence." The young monk thought about it. "No, I heard the sound, and then I heard silence, but I didn't hear the moment of transition. It was like it just disappeared." "Exactly," Jiro said. "It didn't disappear. It dissolved, like salt dissolving in water. The salt doesn't disappear, it becomes part of the water. The sound doesn't disappear, it becomes part of the silence. And if you listen carefully enough, you can hear that the silence is not empty. It's full of dissolved sound, full of every sound that has ever been made and will ever be made, all of it dissolved into the silence, waiting." The young monk stood very still, trying to understand. "Listen again," Jiro said. He struck the bell once more. This time, the young monk listened differently. He listened not just with his ears, but with his whole body, his whole being. He followed the sound as it faded, stayed with it, and when it became so quiet that he couldn't hear it anymore, he kept listening to the silence itself. And in that silence, he heard something. Not a sound, exactly. More like a presence, a fullness, a sense that the silence was alive, that it was not empty space but full space, pregnant with possibility, with potential sound, with everything that could ever be. When he opened his eyes, there were tears on his face. He didn't know why he was crying, he just was. Jiro placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now you understand. The bell is not teaching you about sound. It's teaching you about silence. And silence is teaching you about everything else, about life, death, thoughts, emotions, existence itself. Everything arises from silence and returns to silence. And the silence is always here, always present, waiting for us to notice." The young monk bowed deeply. "Thank you." He returned to the meditation hall, but something had changed in him. He carried the teaching of the bell with him, not as knowledge but as experience, as something felt and lived. Years passed. Jiro grew older. His body bent, his hair whitened, but his practice with the bell deepened. Every time he rang it, he did so with complete attention, complete presence. The bell became his teacher, his practice, his path. He needed nothing else. One spring morning, Jiro went to ring the bell for dawn meditation. He walked to the courtyard as he had done thousands of times before. He picked up the mallet. He stood in silence, listening to the silence, feeling the cool morning air, the dampness of dew, the first light touching the mountains. He raised the mallet and struck the bell. The sound rang out, pure and clear, and as it did, something in Jiro's chest opened completely. He felt himself dissolve into the sound, become the sound, and then dissolve further into the silence from which the sound came and into which it would return. There was no Jiro standing there listening to a bell. There was just listening, just sound, just silence, just this moment, complete and eternal. The sound faded, the silence returned, and Jiro stood there, the mallet still in his hand, tears streaming down his face, laughing softly, because he finally understood completely, not with his mind but with every cell of his body, that he had never existed as something separate, that he had always been just this sound and silence, form and emptiness, arising and dissolving, moment after moment after moment, forever. He struck the bell 2 more times, completing the 3 rings, and each ring was a celebration, a hymn of gratitude to the silence that had always been here, holding everything, allowing everything, being everything. When he walked away from the bell that morning, he felt lighter than he had ever felt, as if he were walking on air, as if gravity itself had released him. He went to the meditation hall and sat with the other monks, but he was not sitting as Jiro anymore. He was sitting as the sitting itself, as the breath itself, as the silence itself, aware and awake and utterly free. The abbot looked at him from across the hall and nodded slightly, a smile touching his lips. He could see it, the dissolution, the freedom, the return to the source. Jiro continued to ring the bell for another year. Then one morning, he didn't appear. The monks went to his room and found him lying on his mat, his face peaceful, his body still. He had died in his sleep, quietly, the way sound fades into silence, without drama, without resistance, simply gone. They carried his body to the courtyard and placed it near the bell. The abbot himself picked up the mallet and rang the bell 3 times, and the sound carried across the valley, announcing Jiro's death, honoring his practice, celebrating his return to silence. And the bell continued to hang there, rung 3 times a day by other monks, other hands, but carrying always the teaching that Jiro had learned and embodied, that sound and silence are not separate, that form and emptiness are not different, that life and death are just 2 sides of one thing, and that thing is here, always here, ringing through everything, waiting to be heard. And in a small hut at the edge of a bamboo forest, there lived a monk who had devoted his life to one practice, listening to rain. His name was Daichi, and he had lived alone in the hut for 23 years. The hut was simple 4 walls, a thatched roof, a single room with a mat for sleeping, a low table, a brazier for warmth. The door faced south, and when it was open, Daichi could see the bamboo forest stretching away into the distance, the tall stalks swaying gently in the slightest breeze. Daichi's practice began by accident. He had come to the hut intending to study sutras, to meditate deeply, to achieve some profound realization. He had been a scholar monk in his younger years, well versed in Buddhist philosophy, respected for his insight and learning. But something had happened, or perhaps nothing had happened, which was itself the problem, and he had felt a growing emptiness, a sense that all his knowledge was just words floating in his head, disconnected from lived reality. So he had left the monastery and come here, to this remote hut, seeking something he couldn't name. The first night in the hut, it rained, a soft summer rain, gentle and steady. Daichi lay on his mat, listening, and something about the sound settled into him. It wasn't just pleasant. It was somehow right, complete. The rain fell. each drop distinct but part of a larger whole. And lying there in the darkness, listening, Daichi felt more present than he had felt in years. He listened all night, not sleeping, just listening. And by dawn, when the rain stopped, he had made a decision. He would stop studying sutras. He would stop formal meditation. He would stop trying to achieve anything. He would just listen to rain. It seemed absurd, even to him. How could listening to rain be a practice? What would he learn? What would he achieve? But he had tried the other way, the way of effort and striving and accumulation of knowledge, and it had led him nowhere. So he would try this way, the way of listening, the way of simply being with what was. At first, he listened with his ears. He noticed different kinds of rain, heavy rain and light rain, rain that drummed on the thatched roof and rain that whispered, rain that fell straight down and rain that was blown sideways by wind. He learned to distinguish between rain on bamboo and rain on earth, between rain on leaves and rain on stone. The varieties were endless, but after a few years, his listening deepened. He began to hear not just the sound of rain, but the silence between the drops. He heard the space that held the sound. He heard the waiting, the pause, the possibility, and then his listening deepened further. He began to hear with his whole body. When rain fell, he felt it in his bones, in his breath, in the rhythm of his heart. He wasn't just listening to rain falling outside him. He was rain. The boundary between inside and outside dissolved. There was just rain, falling, an awareness of falling, and no one standing apart from it observing it. Monks from other temples heard about Daichi and came to visit him. They found him strange, eccentric, perhaps even mad. He had no books. He conducted no ceremonies. He didn't even meditate in any formal sense. He just sat in his hut, or walked slowly through the bamboo forest, or worked in his small garden, and when it rained, he listened. "What are you learning?" they would ask him. "Everything," he would say. "But what have you achieved?" "Nothing." They would shake their heads and leave, thinking he had wasted his life, thinking he had given up, thinking he had chosen the path of least resistance and called it practice. But Daichi didn't mind. He had no interest in convincing anyone. He was too busy listening. One autumn, a young woman came to the hut. She was not a monk, not a student of Buddhism. She was simply someone who was suffering. Her husband had died. Her children had moved to distant cities, and she felt utterly alone, as if she had disappeared from the world and no one had noticed. She had heard of Daichi from a traveling merchant who said, "There's a strange old monk who lives in a hut and listens to rain. Maybe he can help you." She didn't know why listening to rain would help anything, but she was desperate enough to try anything. She knocked on Daichi's door. He opened it, looked at her with mild, gentle eyes, and stepped aside. "Come in." She entered and sat on the floor while Daichi made tea. He moved slowly, deliberately, each gesture complete. He poured the tea, handed her a cup, and sat across from her. "Why have you come?" he asked. She told him. About her husband, her loneliness, the way life felt empty now, meaningless, like she was just going through motions, waiting to die. Daichi listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It's not raining now, but when it rains next, come here, sit with me, listen." She didn't understand, but she agreed. 3 days later, in the afternoon, clouds gathered and rain began to fall. The woman walked through the bamboo forest to Daichi's hut and knocked. He opened the door. "Come," he said. They sat together in the hut. the door open, rain falling outside. Daichi said nothing. He simply sat and listened, his eyes half closed, his body still. The woman didn't know what to do. She sat uncomfortably, her mind racing with thoughts. This is stupid. This is a waste of time. How is listening to rain going to help me? I should leave, but she stayed, because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to try. After a while, her thoughts began to slow. The constant chatter in her mind grew quieter. She found herself actually listening to the rain, hearing its rhythm, its variations, the way it fell on the roof, on the earth, on the bamboo. Time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe two. The woman lost track. There was just rain, falling, and the sound of it, filling everything. When the rain finally stopped, Daichi opened his eyes fully and looked at her. What did you hear? What? She thought about it. Rain. What else? I don't know. Just rain. Did you think about your husband? She realized she hadn't. For the entire time she was listening to the rain, she hadn't thought about her husband, or her children, or her loneliness. She had just been here, listening, present. No, she said quietly, I didn't. And in that time, were you suffering? She looked at him, understanding beginning to dawn. No, I wasn't. Daichi nodded. The rain doesn't take away your grief. Your grief is real. Your loss is real. But the rain shows you that there are moments when you can just be here, just this, without the story, without the pain. And if there can be one moment like that, there can be another and another. The woman felt tears on her face. How do I find those moments? You don't find them. You let them find you. You just listen, not just to rain, to everything, to wind, to birds, to your own breath. And in the listening, you become present. And in presence, suffering loosens its grip. She came back many times over the following months. Sometimes it was raining, sometimes it wasn't. She would sit with Daichi, and he would teach her to listen not as a distraction from her grief, but as a way of being with her grief without being consumed by it. She learned to sit with her sadness the way she sat with rain, letting it be there, letting it fall, not pushing it away, not clinging to it, just allowing it. And slowly, over time, the grief that had felt like it would crush her became something she could carry. It didn't go away, but it became part of her, integrated, like rain soaking into earth, nourishing rather than drowning. Years passed. The woman's life didn't become happy in any conventional sense. She still missed her husband. She still felt lonely sometimes. But she had learned to listen, and in the listening, she found moments of peace, moments of presence, moments where life felt full rather than empty. She told others about Daichi, and slowly, more people came. Not many, but a few. People who were suffering, people who were lost, people who had tried everything else and found no relief. They would come to the hut, sit with Daichi, and learn to listen. Daichi never called himself a teacher. He never gave formal instruction. He just sat with people and listened, and in his listening, they learned to listen too. It was a strange practice, hard to explain, easy to dismiss, but for those who stayed with it, it was transformative. One winter evening, it began to snow. Daichi sat in his hut, the door open, watching the snow fall. It was silent, or nearly silent, just the softest whisper of flakes landing on the ground, on the roof, on the bamboo. He listened to the silence of the snow. He listened to the cold air, the stillness, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. And sitting there, listening, he felt complete. He had no great realization, no sudden enlightenment, just this. Snow falling, silence holding it, and awareness present, aware of it all, part of it all. He thought about his life. The years of study, the years of striving, the years of thinking. He needed to become something more, something different. And then the years here in this hut, listening to rain, learning that he didn't need to become anything because he already was everything. Because in listening deeply enough, the listener dissolved and there was only the listening. And the listening was the same as the rain, the same as the snow, the same as everything. He sat all night, watching the snow, listening to the silence, and by morning, when the first light touched the bamboo forest, he knew it was time. He lay down on his mat, pulled his thin blanket over himself, and closed his eyes. His breath slowed, his heartbeat slowed. He listened to his own dying the way he had listened to rain for 23 years, with complete attention, complete presence, complete acceptance. And then, as gently as snow falling, he let go. The breath stopped, the heartbeat stopped, and what had been Daichi became part of the silence, part of the snow, part of everything. The woman who had first come to him found his body the next morning. She stood in the doorway of the hut, looking at his peaceful face, and she felt not sadness but gratitude. He had taught her how to listen, how to be present, how to find moments of peace in the midst of suffering. It was the greatest gift anyone had ever given her. She and others carried his body into the bamboo forest and cremated it there. The flames rising into the cold winter air, the smoke drifting up through the bamboo stalks and disappearing into the sky. They scattered his ashes in the forest, and over time, the ashes became part of the earth, and the earth nourished the bamboo, and the bamboo swayed in the wind, and rain fell on it, and the cycle continued, endless and beautiful. The hut remained standing for a few more years, then gradually fell into disrepair, then collapsed, then was absorbed back into the forest. But the practice Daichi had embodied continued in the people he had taught. They listened to rain, they listened to wind, they listened to their own breath, and in the listening, they found what Daichi had found, that presence is enough, that this moment is complete, that nothing is missing and nothing needs to be added, that life, exactly as it is sufficient. And in a monastery garden, where stone paths wound between careful beds of moss and a single cherry tree stood at the center, there was a gardener. His name was Kenzo, and he had tended this garden for 40 years. Every morning, he would wake before dawn, dress in his work clothes, and walk to the garden. He would bow to the cherry tree, as he always did, and then he would begin his work. The work was simple: sweeping fallen leaves, pulling weeds, trimming branches, raking the gravel in the patterns that had been established centuries before, watering the moss, checking for insects, adjusting stones that had been shifted by rain or wind. It was the kind of work that could be done mindlessly, and for the first few years, Kenzo did it that way. His hands moved through familiar motions while his mind wandered to worries, to memories, to plans for the future, to judgments about the other monks, to fantasies about the life he might have lived if he hadn't entered the monastery. But one spring morning, as he was raking the gravel, he stopped. He stood there, rake in hand, and looked at the pattern he had just made. Parallel lines, perfectly straight, running the length of the garden. He had made this pattern thousands of times. His hands knew how to do it without thought. But looking at it now, really looking, he saw it differently. The lines were not just lines. They were expressions of order, of care, of attention. They transformed the gravel from chaos to form. They created beauty where there had been randomness, and he realized this was not just garden work. This was practice. This was meditation. This was everything he had been seeking through formal meditation, through study, through years of trying to still his mind and achieve some state of enlightenment. It was right here, in the rake, in the gravel, in the simple act of creating order, moment by moment, line by line. From that day forward, Kenzo worked differently. His hands still moved through the same motions, but now his mind was present with them. When he swept leaves, he felt each sweep of the broom, heard the soft shush of bristles on stone, saw the leaves gather and move. When he pulled weeds, he felt the earth yield, felt the roots come free, noticed the empty space left behind. Everything became practice. Everything became meditation. The garden was his temple, his teacher, his path. Years passed. Kenzo's work became more refined, more subtle. Other monks would walk through the garden and feel something they couldn't name, a sense of peace, of order, of rightness. The garden looked the same as it always had, but something about it had deepened. It wasn't just beautiful. It was awake. One day, the abbot came to the garden and found Kenzo sitting beneath the cherry tree, his tools laid aside, his eyes closed. "Kenzo," the abbot said, "are you resting?" Kenzo opened his eyes and smiled. "No, master, I'm working. But you're not doing anything. I'm letting the garden teach me." The abbot sat down beside him. "What is it teaching you today?" Kenzo was quiet for a moment, listening, feeling. Then he said, "It's teaching me that the work is never finished. Every day, leaves fall. Every day, weeds grow. Every day, the wind disturbs the gravel. I could work forever and never be done. And that's not a problem. That's the point. The point of what? Of everything. Life is not a problem to solve. It's a garden to tend. You do the work, not to finish it, but because the work itself is the life. The raking is the life. The sweeping is the life. The growing and dying and growing again, that's the life." The abbot nodded slowly. "You have become a true gardener." "No," Kenzo said. "I have become the garden." They sat together in silence, teacher and student, though it was no longer clear which was which. The cherry tree above them was in full bloom, petals drifting down like snow, landing on their shoulders, on the ground, on the surface of the pond where koi moved slowly through the water. "There's something else," Kenzo said after a while. "Something the garden has been trying to teach me for years, and I'm only just beginning to understand." "What is it?" "That the garden doesn't grow itself. I tend it, yes, but I don't make it grow. The moss grows itself. The cherry tree blooms itself. The stones sit themselves. I just participate. I help. But the real work is done by the garden, by life itself, by something much bigger than me." He looked at his hands, weathered and scarred from decades of work. "I used to think I was important. I was the gardener. I made the garden beautiful. But now I see that I'm just another element, like the rain, like the sun. I contribute, but I'm not essential. The garden would be here without me, different, maybe, but still here, still growing, still dying, still beautiful." "And how does that feel?" the abbot asked. "Free," Kenzo said. "It feels free." The abbot stood and bowed to Kenzo. Not the formal bow of teacher to student, but the deep bow of one who recognizes enlightenment when he sees it, even if that enlightenment is expressed through raking gravel and pulling weeds rather than through philosophical discourse. Kenzo continued to tend the garden for another 10 years. His body grew weaker, his back more bent, but his practice deepened. He worked more slowly, but more completely. Every gesture was full, sufficient, complete in itself. Young monks would sometimes ask him to teach them about gardening. He would hand them a rake and say, "Rake." They would rake, and he would watch, and after a while he would say, "Slower. Feel the rake. Feel the gravel. Be here." Most didn't understand. They wanted instruction, technique, secrets, but Kenzo had no secrets. He only had presence, and presence couldn't be taught, only demonstrated, only lived. One autumn morning, Kenzo went to the garden as usual. He bowed to the cherry tree, now bare of leaves, its branches stark against the pale sky. He picked up his rake and began to work on the gravel, creating the patterns he had created 10,000 times before. He worked slowly, methodically, his breath steady, his mind quiet. The parallel lines emerged, perfect and straight, and he felt deep satisfaction, not because the pattern was beautiful, but because he was completely here, completely present, completely absorbed in the simple act of raking. When he finished, he set the rake down and stood back, looking at the pattern. The morning light slanted across it, creating subtle shadows that made the lines seem almost three-dimensional, alive. He nodded to himself, satisfied, and then he felt something shift in his chest. Not pain exactly, just a loosening, a letting go. He walked to the cherry tree and sat down beneath it, his back against the trunk. He looked out at the garden, the moss, the stones, the pond, the gravel with its fresh patterns. He had spent 40 years here, tending this small piece of earth, and it had given him everything. It had taught him how to work, how to be present, how to participate in life without needing to control it, how to let go. He closed his eyes and took a breath. The air was cool, smelling of autumn, of leaves decaying, of the earth preparing for winter. He exhaled slowly, feeling his breath leave his body and merge with the air around him. He took another breath, but this time, something was different. The breath came in easily, but when he tried to exhale, it wouldn't leave. It stayed in his chest, held there, and Kenzo understood. He smiled. He had always wondered how it would happen, and now he knew, gently, quietly. In the garden he loved, beneath the tree he had bowed to every morning for 40 years, he let go. The breath released, and with it, everything else, his body, his mind, his sense of being Kenzo, all of it dissolving like mist in morning sun. They found him later that morning, still sitting beneath the cherry tree, his face peaceful, his hands resting in his lap. The monks carried him to the funeral hall and prepared his body for cremation. But before they did, they took him back to the garden one last time, laid him on the ground near the cherry tree, and covered him with flowers. The next morning, a young monk was assigned to tend the garden. He had watched Kenzo work for years, but he had never really understood what the old gardener was doing. Now, standing in the garden with a rake in his hands, he felt the weight of responsibility, the impossible task of maintaining something he didn't fully comprehend. He began to rake the gravel, trying to recreate the patterns Kenzo had made. His lines were crooked at first, uneven, and he felt frustrated, inadequate. But then he remembered something Kenzo had said once, in passing to another monk. The pattern doesn't matter. What matters is being present while you make it. The young monk stopped trying to make perfect lines. He simply raked, slowly, feeling the rake in his hands, feeling the resistance of the gravel, hearing the soft scraping sound. He raked for an hour, and when he was done, the pattern was far from perfect, but something had shifted in him. He had been present. He had been here, and that, he began to understand, was the real work. The garden continued. Seasons turned. Different hands tended it, some better than others. But the garden itself remained, teaching the same lessons it had always taught, that life is in the work, that beauty comes from attention, that nothing lasts but everything matters, and that the highest practice is simply being here, fully, completely, raking gravel or pulling weeds or sitting beneath a cherry tree, participating in the great growing and dying that is life itself. The stories are fading now, dissolving like footprints in sand, like breath in cold air, like everything eventually dissolves. And that's all right. That's how it should be. You've been here through all of this, or perhaps you left somewhere along the way, drifting into sleep while monks counted breaths and weavers wove cloth and bells rang into silence. Either way, you're exactly where you need to be. The night is deep now. The world outside is quiet, or as quiet as it gets. Cars passing on distant roads, wind in trees, the hum of electricity in walls, all of it background, all of it part of the silence, the way waves are part of the ocean, distinct but never separate. You don't need these stories anymore. You don't need these words. Your body knows what to do. It's been breathing since before you were born, and it will continue until it's time to stop, and none of that requires your attention or your help. So let go now. Let go of listening. Let go of staying awake. Let go of everything except the simple fact of being here, being held, being safe. Tomorrow will come, and with it all the things that tomorrow brings. But tonight, there's only this: darkness, quiet, rest. Your body sinking deeper into sleep. Your mind releasing its hold on thought, on worry, on the constant work of being awake. The monks are sleeping in their monasteries. The weavers have left their looms. The gardener has returned to the earth. The rain has stopped falling, though it will fall again. Everything rests. Everything pauses. Everything takes a breath and lets it go. And you can too. Close your eyes if they're not closed. Feel your breath slow. Feel your thoughts scatter and fade. Feel yourself drifting, like a leaf on water, carried by a current you don't need to understand or control. You are safe. You are held. You are exactly where you belong. Sleep now. Deep and dreamless, or full of dreams, it doesn't matter. Sleep the way stones sleep, the way mountains sleep, the way the earth itself sleeps between breaths. Rest, completely, fully, without reservation. The stories are over. The night is yours.